There is a word buried in Matthew chapter 24 that most English Bible translations obscure. It is one Greek word, 8 English letters, and when you understand what it actually means, not the polished translation but the raw original, the entire chapter transforms. Not just the verse it appears in, the whole chapter. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. So let me ask you something before we begin. When you read Matthew 24, what do you feel? For most people, the honest answer is some version of dread. Wars, famines, earthquakes, persecution, betrayal, false prophets, the end of the world. It reads like a list of catastrophes with no connecting thread, no logic, no mercy. Just disaster after disaster until it stops. But what if the chapter isn't a list of catastrophes? What if it's a map? What if Jesus wasn't describing chaos, but a pattern? A pattern with a specific structure, a predictable progression, and a destination most people never reach because they stop reading before they get there? By the end of this study, you will see Matthew 24 differently than you ever have before. Not because I'm going to add something to the text, but because we're going to slow down and read what's actually there, including one word in verse 8 that changes everything. Let me set the scene for you because context matters enormously here. Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives. It's the final week of his earthly ministry. He and his disciples have just walked out of the temple complex, and his disciples have pointed out the massive structure. Enormous stones, gleaming gold, the architectural crown of Jerusalem and the center of Jewish religious life for generations. And Jesus responds with words that stop them cold. Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left upon another. Everyone will be thrown down. The disciples are stunned. And privately, as they sit on the hillside looking back at the city, they ask him 3 questions. When will this happen? What will be the sign of your coming? And what will be the sign of the end of the age? 3 questions. 1 conversation. And what Jesus says next is the most detailed prophetic roadmap he ever gave. But here's what I want you to notice right away. Jesus doesn't lead with the dramatic climax. He doesn't open with the return of the Son of Man in the clouds. He begins earlier, and with something that most readers move past too quickly. Because Jesus answers a question most people don't even realize he's answering. What happens first? Let's read it carefully. Matthew 24, verses 6 through 8. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Now, at first glance, this seems straightforward. Wars, famines, earthquakes, difficult times ahead. But I want you to slow down and notice something critical about how Jesus frames this section. He doesn't say, when you see these wars, the end has come. He says the exact opposite. See that you are not troubled. The end is not yet. The wars are not the end. Jesus is emphatic about this. They are, as he puts it, the beginning, the opening movement of something larger. But the beginning of what? This is where the Greek becomes essential. The word translated sorrows in most English Bibles is the Greek word ōdin. And ōdin doesn't mean generic suffering. It doesn't mean misfortune. It doesn't mean hardship in a vague sense. It means birth pains. Specifically, the contractions a woman experiences during labor, the rhythmic, escalating pains that signal a child is about to be delivered. Now, why does that distinction matter so much? Because birth pains are not like ordinary suffering. Birth pains have 3 specific characteristics that random suffering does not. And once you understand these 3 characteristics, the entire prophetic sequence in Matthew 24 makes sense in a way that it never did before. The first characteristic, birth pains escalate. Each contraction is more intense than the one before. Labor doesn't stay at a constant level of discomfort. It builds, it increases, it intensifies. And the signs Jesus lists follow exactly the same pattern. They aren't static background noise that has always existed. They grow. The famines become more severe. The earthquakes multiply. The scope widens. Each phase is harder than the one that preceded it. The second characteristic, and this one is critical, is that the intervals shorten. Think about how labor actually works. Early on, contractions might be 20 minutes apart, then 15, then 10, then 5, then seconds. The closer you get to delivery, the faster the contractions come. And scholars who have studied this passage carefully note something remarkable. In the early centuries of church history, the signs Jesus described occurred across long intervals. Wars happened, famines struck, but centuries might separate the major crises. The pattern Jesus described suggests that as history moves toward its culmination, those intervals compress. The signs begin overlapping, converging, intensifying. And for anyone living in 2026, paying even casual attention to global events, that acceleration is hard to miss. The third characteristic, and this is the one that should strike you most deeply, is that birth pains have a destination. A woman in labor is not suffering randomly. The pain has a purpose. It's moving towards something, the delivery of a child. And the signs Jesus describes are not random global chaos. They are purposeful prophetic markers, moving history towards something specific, the return of Christ and the establishment of God's kingdom. The pain has a point. The suffering has a direction. And the direction is not annihilation. The direction is glory. That word, ōdin, changes everything, because it reframes every difficult headline you read, every earthquake, every conflict, every social fracture. These are not evidence that the universe has come unhinged. They are contractions. They are purposeful. They are moving toward a delivery. But here's a detail that most people walk right past, and it changes how the entire passage lands. Look at verse 6 again. Right in the middle of describing wars and global upheaval, Jesus gives a direct command. See that you are not troubled. This isn't a casual suggestion. The Greek word is throeo. It means to be alarmed, to cry out in terror, to be thrown into a panic. Jesus is not saying, try not to worry too much. He is saying, do not panic. Do not be thrown. Do not spiral. Why? For all these things must come to pass. The word translated must here is the Greek word day, and day indicates divine necessity. These events aren't accidents. They aren't surprises to God. They are required elements of a sovereign timeline that must unfold before the end arrives. The wars, the famines, the earthquakes, they are on the timeline. They are expected. God is not surprised by them, and he commands his people not to be undone by them. And then Jesus adds 5 words that carry enormous weight. But the end is not yet. The wars are significant enough that Jesus addresses them directly. But they are not the end. They are the beginning, and the beginning is building towards something. Now let's trace the sequence that follows, because Jesus didn't stop there. After the global signs, the wars and famines and earthquakes, something shifts. The focus moves. Verse 9. Then they will deliver you up to be afflicted and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Notice the transition. Jesus moves from describing what happens to the world to describing what happens to his followers. Delivered up, afflicted, killed, hated by all nations. And the reason for this hatred is not political affiliation, not ethnicity, not ideology. Jesus says it plainly, for my name's sake. Believers face hostility not for what they do, but for who they follow. But then the next sign cuts even closer. Verse 10. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. This isn't persecution coming from hostile governments or foreign powers. This is betrayal from within, from people who once stood beside you, people who once shared your faith, people you thought you knew. Luke's gospel expands on this. Luke 21 verse 16 says, you will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, relatives and friends. Matthew 10 puts it starkly. A man's enemies will be those of his own household. The breakdown Jesus describes isn't only global. It's relational. It's the neighbor who turns away, the friend who distances themselves, the family member who chooses safety over solidarity. And for many believers, then and now, that betrayal, that loneliness, is harder than any external persecution. Now here's where the sequence becomes even more significant, because Jesus explains what rises in the environment created by fear, betrayal, and shattered trust. Verse 11. And many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. Not a few false prophets. Many. And not deceiving a handful of gullible people. Deceiving many. Why does this happen? Because when people are afraid, when they've been betrayed, when the institutions they trusted have failed them, they become desperate for someone who can explain what's happening. Someone who can tell them what to do. Someone who speaks with certainty in a world that feels like it has none. And that desperation is precisely what false teachers exploit. They use biblical language. They reference scripture. They offer clarity and confidence in a season of chaos. But Jesus warned his disciples in advance. Deception multiplies during these times. The environment of fear creates exactly the conditions in which falsehood flourishes. And then verse 12, the sign that describes what happens to the broader culture when all of this converges. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. The Greek word for lawlessness is anomia, the rejection of moral structure, the abandonment of limits. And notice what Jesus connects it to directly. Because lawlessness abounds, not in spite of it, but because of it, love grows cold. The moral collapse isn't only societal. It infects relationships. It erodes compassion, creates isolation. People who were once warm become guarded. People who once gave freely begin protecting what they have. The temperature drops. So let me trace the full pattern clearly, because Jesus has given us a sequence with a logic. Wars and rumors of wars, the atmosphere of global conflict becomes the permanent background noise of life. Famines and disease, essential systems begin to break down. Earthquakes, creation itself seems to be shaking. Then the focus narrows. Persecution, hostility toward believers intensifies. Betrayal, even close relationships fracture under pressure. False prophets, deception multiplies because fear has created the perfect audience for it. Lawlessness, moral categories collapse. Love grows cold, compassion erodes, and isolation deepens. And through all of this, Jesus calls it one thing: the beginning of birth pains. Not the middle, not the end. The beginning. The labor is